Over the last decade, the laws governing Missouri's mandated reporter requirements have seen many changes. In 2013, for example, changes were made that are of particular importance for EMS and other healthcare providers. These changes were reaffirmed in 2017.
You have already chosen in your life to serve others. There's some deeper calling that has brought you to the point where you want to make others your priority, and I really honor you for that. By doing that, you've also joined Missouri's Child Protection Network. You as a mandated reporter are asked and required, and I'm sure you want to, identify child abuse and neglect and report that so appropriate action can be taken. In this training, you will learn not only how to identify child abuse and neglect, but also how to report it through our state's hotline. We have a number in Missouri that children can call, that's 844-CAN-TELL. Honestly, we get very few calls from children. Why is that? Because children count on the adults in their life to protect them. And like any other part of your job, this is something that you have to get good at. You have to learn to identify and how to make an effective call that leads to appropriate action. Then we can take over, conduct an investigation, and perhaps connect families to the needed services. This is so vital, and it's something we can only do together. So thank you for joining Missouri's Child Protection Network. Thank you for attending this training today. Please be fully present because this is vitally important to the safety of our children. Thank you again for being here.
In this session, we're going to take a look at the most up-to-date information on mandated reporting. We'll answer several questions, including who is a mandated reporter under Missouri law? What are the legal responsibilities of mandated reporters? When should a reporter call the abuse and neglect hotline? A mandated reporter is anyone who, in addition to having a moral and ethical responsibility to report suspected cases of abuse and neglect, is also required by law to do so. But who exactly is considered a mandatory reporter? Lists vary from state to state, and up until just a few years ago, Missouri law was a bit unclear and full of loopholes. However, there have since been several changes made, improvements which have made the law more specific. Today, Missouri's mandated reporters include teachers, law enforcement officials, and healthcare providers, anyone who has a professional responsibility for the care of children.
By law, mandated reporters must report to the hotline when they have any reasonable cause to even suspect that a child is, has been in the past, or maybe in the future, abused or neglected. Mandated reporters must also report to the hotline when they observe a child in conditions or circumstances that would reasonably result in abuse or neglect. Under the law, anyone who's responsible for the care of children is a mandated reporter. This includes, but is not limited to, all medical providers, mental health care professionals, social workers, daycare staff, school personnel, ministers, and all law enforcement.
If your EMT or paramedic school experience was anything like mine, the classroom discussion on mandated reporting was only brief, very brief, maybe a little too brief. The instructor said, hey, if you suspect child abuse, you need to hotline the abuser. That was it. After class, several of my classmates told me that they had no idea what the word hotline even meant. Now, I'm sure that the instructor had just made a simple, honest mistake in thinking that brand new EMT students would automatically know what a hotline meant, to contact the proper authorities and let them know about the abuse or neglect. The only problem was, no one ever told us who the proper authorities were. All we knew was that we were supposed to call someone. A police officer? That sounded good. What about a nurse in the emergency department? It sounds good too. She seemed like she knew what she was doing. And it all seemed to make perfect sense. Tell a nurse or a cop that you think a child is being abused, and case closed. End of story. We've done all we need to do, right? Wait a sec. What are these? What the heck are these? Oh, okay. This is making a lot more sense. This must be what my instructor meant by hotline, or I guess I should say hotlines. Who knew? So you call the one up there to report child abuse and neglect, and then you call the other one to report abuse and neglect of the elderly or the intellectually or developmentally disabled. Oh, and by the way, both of these numbers have been added to the contact list in your truck's cell phone. Until you've called the hotline and given your report to social services, you haven't really met the state's mandated reporter requirement. So while it might also be a good idea to inform the police, the nurse, or battalion chief, the law actually requires that you personally pick up the phone and call the hotline whenever you suspect abuse and neglect. In 2016, the Children's Division of the Department of Social Services received over 129,000 reports of child abuse and neglect. About 66% of these calls were made by mandated reporters, and over 75% of these children being abused and neglected were reported only one time. Think about that for a moment. If the individuals who had made these calls had instead chosen not to call the hotline, it's possible that no one ever would have. The possibilities of what might have happened to these children are absolutely horrifying. Of all abused children, nearly half are less than 7 years old, and 62% of abusers are the child's own biological parents. The two most prevalent characteristics of a perpetrator are a history of criminal behavior and substance abuse. Of Missouri children who died in 2015, 37% died as the direct result of child abuse and neglect. There are several different types of abuse, but for now we're only going to discuss these four: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. In children, neglect is by far the most common, with the combination of physical and sexual abuse not too far behind. Later on, we'll examine a couple of abuse and neglect situations often unique to the elderly and the intellectually or developmentally disabled. But first, let's take a quick look at the problem of child abuse. In Missouri, a child is anyone under the age of 18. Missouri law defines child abuse as any physical, sexual, or emotional abuse inflicted upon a child other than by accidental means by those who are responsible for the child's care, custody, and control, except that discipline, including spanking, administered in a reasonable manner, shall not be construed as abuse.
6-week-old baby is in critical condition tonight after Wentzville police say he suffered from one of the worst cases of child abuse they had ever seen. News 4's Brian Feldman live tonight at our St. Charles County newsroom. Brian, what are the child's parents accused of doing?
Well, Claire, officials are calling it consistent and habitual child abuse. The boy's father allegedly stuck his fingers down the baby's throat to get it to stop crying while the mother did nothing. Not only that, officials are saying there's evidence of prior injuries, including broken bones and internal bleeding.
I don't see how anybody who's normal could do something like that.
Tim Lomar says 19-year-old Robert Burnett and 20-year-old Megan Hendricks are charged with child abuse and endangering the welfare of a child, who is identified only as JB. The 6-week-old child is alive, but if he lives, officials say his quality of life will be extremely minimal.
If this evidence is proven to be true, they're completely incapable of parenting this child.
Before they turn 18, 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused. And the United States Department of Justice reports this rate is even higher among children with disabilities, who are 5 times more likely to be sexually abused.
I cry like a baby when I'm slapped. I'm horrible to have around. I don't deserve to have any friends. I never do anything right. I'm a nobody.
Emotional abuse includes any injury to a child's psychological, emotional stability in a way that substantially changes or impairs the child's behavior, emotional response, or cognition. These children can display such behaviors as anxiety, depression, withdrawal, or aggressiveness. Victims of emotional abuse may exhibit extremes in behavior, such as being overly compliant or demanding, extremely passive, or highly aggressive. You may also observe behaviors in children that suggest suicidal thoughts. Once again, the child's caretakers can also exhibit very telling behaviors. Perhaps they constantly blame or belittle or berate the child, or perhaps they seem entirely complacent about the child's well-being.
Whose body is showing signs of extreme malnutrition was discovered among scenes of the most appalling squalor. It's likely that his body had lain undiscovered for the best part of 2 years.
Sometimes a perpetrator looks exactly the way you might imagine. Other times they don't appear to fit the bill at all. But as the saying goes, you can't judge a book by its cover. However, you can be on the lookout for other, more helpful clues to the presence of abuse or neglect. Now, pay attention. Indicators of physical abuse should be taken with a grain of salt. They're just a general guide. The presence of the indicators alone does not prove that someone has been abused or neglected. But when you do find some of these indicators present, your index of suspicion should increase. In contrast to most cases of physical abuse, physical indicators of sexual abuse are rarely evident. One study found that only 4% of abused children had abnormal physical examinations at the time of medical evaluation. SCAD Policy 7 includes details on various indicators of child abuse. And for additional information on how to recognize the signs of physical, sexual, and emotional child abuse and neglect, click the link at the bottom of this page.